Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, coming at you with another fantastic guest today. And I do just want to keep shouting out the guys who helped me make the intro video. Rodney Leinhardt did all the editing of the video, and Rico James, my man Eric McEdward here in Vermont, put together that beat for me. So thank you, gentlemen, very much for that. I do want to just do the usuals off the top here. Some of my last couple of guests here. Wolf Siegel, great interview with Wolf the other day, talking about his backstory. And if you haven't checked that out, I encourage you all to, because this guy lost a lot of his life to jail time for weed. Kyle Sheridan from Sunny Gardens VT, Jim Barry out in Michigan, who is a caretaker working for Kaba Technologies, a lighting company. Kerry Bennett from Hometown Cultivation. And, just a couple in this sort of vein here, I want to shout out also Carl Craig, Dr. Carl Craig. We got another science interview coming at you today here. And I just do want to shout out a couple interviews I got coming up. Tiffany Burt on Thursday, Travis Cesarone on Sunday the 10th. If you guys haven't seen any things he's been writing about, I highly encourage you to go check out Travis's work. And then on Tuesday the 12th, I got Carl Giannone from down in Massachusetts as well. And then on Friday, I've got Suhiko Ono. And then I'm going to take St. Patrick's Day off. But we'll be back. I'm going to be stacking the lineup with a lot of guests from labs around the country, because I find this stuff to be fascinating. And that is why I've got my guest here today. And I want to give him a proper introduction. He is the founder and chief scientific officer, ProVerde Labs, and wham bam, it's Chris Hudalla. Dr. Chris, hey, thank you for being here with me today, man.
Good to see you, Caleb.
I appreciate it. Before we do anything serious, would you give us a 5-minute life story?
Sure. So I was living in California, and I did my Ph.D. work in analytical chemistry there, doing structural characterization of materials for material science. Following my doctorate, I went for a postdoctoral position at the University of Nebraska Medical Center doing cancer research. I did that for about 2 years, after which I relocated to Massachusetts. And then I started working for a company that is one of the leading manufacturers of chromatographic instrumentation. That's the equipment that we use in our laboratory for much of our characterization of cannabis. In 2013, when Massachusetts legalized medical marijuana, we approached the state and made a case for regulated, mandated testing. And after a little bit of a challenge with them, Massachusetts became the first state to mandate analytical testing of cannabis, at which point I gave my notice with my former company to start ProVerde Laboratories. And so we started in early 2013. We were among the first laboratories in the country to have the ISO 17025 accreditation specifically towards cannabis, and have been kind of struggling and growing with the industry ever since. So that's maybe the formative version.
And for the rest of this, I'm going to put you over in the big box. Would you mind telling us, I'm going to back you up a little. I'd love to hear a bit about your PhD research.
So it was in nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. In many respects, it's like an MRI instrument, but it's designed for materials characterization. So we were looking at, they're called amorphous solids, but glass materials, for their structural characterization, to look at how the atoms were connected to each other. It's a little bit esoteric, but...
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear from all the scientists about what they were doing, for their postdoc and things of that nature.
So the postdoc was actually a little more interesting, because we were again using nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, but we were characterizing binding of novel chemotherapeutic agents, and with the intent on trying to create structures that would target specific tumors. So bringing chemotherapeutic agents specifically to the tumor of interest, rather than going throughout the whole body. As most people know, chemotherapy is quite devastating on the human body, and being able to design structures that would specifically target specific locations or specific tumors is fairly interesting.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I believe on the phone you said we had some interesting results. Would you care to share any of those with us, Chris?
Interesting results with the cancer research.
Yeah, I believe that's in my notes here. I have it in quotes. We had some interesting results.
Well, so we found that by taking traditional chemotherapeutic agents and binding them to specific ligands that would attract the tumors, we could literally take that chemotherapeutic agent and bring it right to the target tissue.
Huh.
So that was quite interesting at the time.
Yeah, and that sounds, like it might have some applications with cannabis. I know that a lot of the research has shown that cannabis sort of attacks tumors. I don't know the proper way to say that, but I feel like there's going to be some crossover here, maybe.
There's significant crossover. Probably one of my heroes in the industry is Dr. Dedi Miri, who's an oncologist in Israel, who's probably one of the leading researchers that has, a wealth of information that is specific to oncology as it can be mitigated by cannabinoid therapies. And unfortunately, one of the things that his data shows, or at least my interpretation of it, is that there's just so much more that we don't understand. It's not just as simple as you treat cancer with cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's unfortunate that it's been so difficult for scientists to secure funding to do this type of research, in my opinion.
Well, not only funding, but it's prohibited. It's illegal to do a lot of this research, or has been historically in the U.S. So we have decades where real fundamental research into how to grow the plant, how to process or extract the plant, what it's good for, different types of conditions. If you Google any medical condition and cannabis, you'll find that people are using cannabis to treat such a wide variety of conditions, and some of it's anecdotal, but there's some significant research that has been done in a peer-reviewed manner, and so it still continues to show a lot of promise in that regard.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Mm-hmm. I've seen, and if you get enough anecdotal evidence, eventually that might become a case study or something.
Yep.
Okay. So I also wanted to ask you, before we dive too much deeper into the weed thing, is about this other job you have for this company where you guys are manufacturing HPLC equipment. That sounded super interesting. And thanks to Rodney. Hey, Rodney, he's watching the show here. Always very supportive, man. Thanks.
So there's a couple of main providers of analytical instrumentation, and one of them is Waters Corporation. They are a Massachusetts-based company right here in Milford, Massachusetts, where ProVerde was established. I worked for Waters Corporation as a research chemist for about 14 years before I left. And as part of that, we were developing new instruments or new separation technologies to basically improve the options that researchers had for digging into the weeds of what's in their product. So if you think about a pharmaceutical drug development, anytime they create a drug synthetically, there's also byproducts or contaminants that are produced. This instrumentation is perfect for looking at those contaminants. One of the things that I focused on when I was, my last thing I did when I was with Waters was counterfeit foods and food adulterants. Yeah. So really interesting honey adulteration or counterfeit maple syrup. It's a huge business to counterfeit your honey or your maple syrup.
How do people counterfeit honey or maple syrup, Chris?
Yes, you add high fructose corn syrup. It's a lot cheaper, and the bees don't have to put out the high fructose corn syrup. And so if you can take your maple syrup or your honey and dilute it 10% with high fructose corn syrup, you're saving millions of dollars. And when you start looking at states like Vermont or countries like Canada that pride themselves on the quality of their maple syrup, having their products adulterated, they take that pretty seriously.
They sure do. And I remember the McDonald's lawsuit way back when.
Yeah.
Yep. They don't fuck around with that here, Chris. But I also saw an interesting study where they took Rice Krispie treats and they they asked, how much of this can we replace with sawdust before the consumer will notice? So this kind of sounds like sort of what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of the shakes at some of the fast food restaurants were being adulterated with styrofoam beads or something crazy like that.
Gross.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. So, would you tell us, please? Yeah, I'd like to just, and here I'm gonna slap this up every like 10 or 15 minutes. Chris Hudalla, ProVerde Laboratories. Would you tell us how you sort of decided to start a lab in the cannabis testing space?
I don't know what the heck I was thinking. It was a big need. So back in 2013, we certainly weren't the first cannabis lab by far, but most of the labs that existed more for doing potency testing. It was used a lot for marketing purposes to show you that my weed's higher, got more THC than somebody else's weed. And so back in 2013, we didn't find very many labs at all, if any, doing heavy metal testing. There were a few labs doing pesticide testing, but it wasn't the norm. It wasn't the norm to do testing for residual solvents. If you're doing hydrocarbon extractions, how much butane is left over? And so in 2013, Massachusetts became the first state to actually mandate testing with a list of contaminants that were required for screening, which included microbial contaminants, mycotoxins, solvents, heavy metals, pesticides, things that there had been documentation in the peer-reviewed literature through case transcripts, hospital records, where people got sick or actually died from consuming cannabis that was tainted. And so that was kind of the beginning of our start as a lab. Again, back in 2013, there weren't very many other labs. I think at that time there was only one other lab in Massachusetts. There were labs in California, but labs were pretty sparse back then. And so there was a huge need. My analytical instrumentation background is perfect because the instrumentation that's necessary to really get to the bottom of what's in these samples is kind of what my doctorate and my years of research was building towards. So it was a good fit.
And one thing I remember you talking about on the phone was this E-Valley stuff, which is something I've talked to a number of other scientists about. And what I'm going to do is save all your hot topics for the end. I got those in the end of my notes, but I do have all my previous notes from our first phone call and the E-Valley stuff. I know I talked to Jeff Rawson about this. And Jeff said he almost died from this. He said he's spent a good amount of time in the ER. And really almost died. And they had no idea what was going on with him. So that seemed super concerning. And I definitely, as one of the states with THC caps, I think Connecticut might have it too, but that was concerning to me, because the manufacturers were like, okay, well, what's going to make up the rest of the product if we have to water this down in some way?
Yeah. Yeah. So E-Valley was pretty serious. I think that the original producers, so they believe right now that it was related to vitamin E acetate that was used to cut these vape products. It had the perfect color. It was very, very light yellow to clear. It had the perfect viscosity, which is really important because sometimes your THC concentrates are so viscous that they don't work well with some of the earlier vape hardware. It needed to flow a little bit to reach the coil, and so cutting it with vitamin E acetate. And of course, everybody knows that vitamin E acetate is good for you. Vitamin E capsules, a lot of people take it as supplements. It's in skin lotions. And so what could be better than putting vitamin E in a vape pen? Only problem is it doesn't belong in your lungs. And that's
right. That seems like the big issue, right, Chris? Like you're not supposed to be inhaling that.
Right. Yep. And so, a lot of the regulatory response was to shut down vape production, or at least in Massachusetts, they limited vape production and sales. And unfortunately, that drove consumers to the black market, which is the only place that the E-Valley product was coming from. So we did not, as far as I'm aware, ever see any E-Valley products coming out of regulatory markets. It was all a black market phenomena for the most part. And so when you shut down the legitimate access to quality products that are produced under regulatory oversight and tested, you shut that down, you force consumers who are now depending on these, you force them to the black market, which is where the problem existed.
And that does seem to be the story, at least, from all the folks I've talked to, and using lead in some of the metal parts in the manufacturing process over in China because it's cheaper to work with. That was, I don't know if that was Jeff Rawson or Josh Weider who was telling me that, but yeah, it said they incorporate lead into the metal because it's easier to work with. It grinds up easier and it's less wear and tear on your tool parts, which was
Well, with the vitamin E acetate, I have to imagine that the first producers that were using vitamin E acetate did not do it out of malice. They just did it out of ignorance. But now we know that vitamin E acetate can kill people. But today we still see vape pens on the market, vape cartridges that still have vitamin E acetate. And they'll have vitamin E acetate with delta 8 THC in them. So these are not the vitamin E acetate issue predated the delta 8 phenomena. And so these are clearly made after we've learned a painful lesson from using the vitamin E acetate. So producers using that now to cut vape products are doing so, I would say maliciously, or they know better.
I'd like to read a comment here. Christine Stenquist. Hey, Chris. I appreciate all the help you gave me in trying to educate our state regulators about the artifacts, quote, degradations that are popping up in some extraction processes. I saw a post this morning suggesting that Delta 8 was related to or similar to the fortification process of vitamins in our food. Can you help clarify why this is faulty thinking when it comes to the intoxicating hemp market? And thanks, Christine. I was trying to save this for later, but if you want to go in on that, Chris, please feel free.
So synthetic chemistry is an important part of our life. We take aspirin without regard. We rely very heavily on the pharmaceutical industry. A lot of our foods are processed. I often hear the production of HHC, hexahydrocannabinol, related to hydrogenation of food oils. And so if it's okay for the food industry, why is it not okay for us? It's important to understand that, we're still learning our lessons when we talk about hydrogenated foods, fats, that there is serious coronary risks associated with that. I don't have the numbers, but the number of people that die from coronary complications because of a high-fat diet, high saturated fats. When we start playing with chemistry without really understanding it, I think that's where it gets us into trouble. I don't really have huge problems with delta 8 THC or these other synthetics necessarily, except that in the process you create many, many, many other synthetic byproducts that are there as contaminants. These contaminants are not found in nature, so we don't know what their biological relevance is. We don't know what their toxicity is. We have no documentation that says they don't cause birth defects or cancer. And so I have some serious concerns for, what are the long-term effects? We've had now several years of people consuming at pretty large rates and large doses synthetic cannabinoids, but it's the contaminants that's in these that are of more concern to me than the cannabinoids.
And, that's something that Josh Swider definitely told me about was, I believe, and Josh, if you're listening, please correct me. I don't want to misquote you, but I believe he was speaking about the conversion from Delta 8 to Delta 9 and showed me like a chart of all of these other byproducts of that conversion. He said, it's not 100% conversion. You don't just take 100% Delta 8 and get 100% Delta 9. During the course of that conversion, you have all of these other things coming out. And if I'm not mistaken, he said, we don't even know what some of these things are.
Yeah, so most of these conversions are starting with CBD. So they're converting CBD into Delta 8. You can also convert it into Delta 9. We do see up to 30 different contaminants. Sometimes the level of contamination is up to 40%. So when you're talking about a distillate, your COA that you're getting with your product might say that it's 96% Delta 8, but in reality, it might only be 50%, and the other portion might be some of these other synthetic byproducts. Things like iso-THC. There's two byproducts that we only see with these synthetic compounds. We do not see them in natural product. We almost use them as a marker for identification of synthetic products, just because they seem to be correlated very closely with the conversion of CBD into THC. I have not seen any studies whatsoever on the toxicity of these compounds. When you go back to the 50s with the drug thalidomide that was commercialized, thalidomide has only two structures, like a right and a left-hand structure. And one of them was really good for nausea, and the other one caused horrific birth defects. Well, because it was good for nausea, it was prescribed widely for morning sickness for pregnant women. Unfortunately, it led to a significant number of fatalities and deformed babies, infants. This drug was not approved in the United States because an FDA reviewer basically put a halt to it, but it was prescribed widely in Canada, Germany, Australia. And so in these countries, they're very familiar to this day with what a thalidomide baby is. Horrific birth defects.
They were being born without arms and legs. I watched a pretty shocking documentary on that.
Yeah. And so that's just two structures. When you think of the THC molecule itself, I know of probably 34 isomers, 34 forms of THC, of which only 2 are ever seen naturally. So when you start taking these iso-THC or compounds that are not found naturally, we haven't tested them on rats yet. We haven't tested them in mice. We're just, going right to consumers and seeing that consumers are being used as unknowing guinea pigs.
Mm-hmm. And this was Josh Weider too, dropping that comment about CBD to Delta 9. So thank you for clearing that up, Josh. I have a hard time keeping up with all you smart motherfuckers. Yeah. Chris, would you please mind, and here, I'm going to just do this again. Chris Hudalla, ProVerde Laboratories here. Would you mind telling us a little bit about what it's like starting a weed testing lab?
So it's changed a lot over the years. I thought that as you mature as a business, things would get easier. And I think in many respects, they've gotten worse. Most of it, from my perspective, is in relation to regulatory ambiguity. When cannabis was legalized in Massachusetts for a medical marijuana, it was under the authority of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And under that system, they communicated very closely with us in terms of what their expectations were, template for reporting so that all labs would report in the same format, the same COA. They gave us an opportunity to meet with them regularly to ask questions, express concerns, to talk about things that needed clarification. And so there was a lot of communication. And so as the Department of Public Health rolled out the testing portion of the medical marijuana program in Massachusetts, it was still new. There still wasn't, we didn't understand back in those days, and probably still don't, like what's an appropriate level for metal contamination? What's an appropriate level for butane residuals in a sample? And Massachusetts today has probably the lowest limit in the United States at 12 ppm. But initially it was set at 1 ppm, which is incredibly challenging to hit. So the early days seemed to be more about learning what's appropriate, learning about testing, developing methods. If you're producing aspirin or Viagra, there's a cookbook of testing requirements and methods that you go to know how to test it, how to look for contaminants, which contaminants to look for. That didn't exist for cannabis. So there was a lot of learning. But it seems like the more we learn, the more we started to lose focus. And when Massachusetts legalized adult use cannabis, it transitioned to our Cannabis Control Commission. And it just seems like things started to get muddier. There were more labs. More labs had different processes. How you report potency in Massachusetts is differed by the lab, even with the same exact analytical results. How those results are handled, whether they're moisture corrected, what equations you use to report total THC. And so for the last couple of years, we found that every lab does it differently. So there's no consistency in product labeling. Today, we still see, I don't know if today, maybe they're shutting it down, but it wasn't uncommon to see 39 or 40% total cannabinoid on a package, 42%. Most people who know the plant start to roll their eyes and say, oh yeah, okay, fine, 42%.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone saw me just do that, but yeah.
Yeah. So we know that that's not a real thing. And so I would think that a regulatory body who's responsible for the testing or oversight of the testing would take a second look at that 42% and say, let me send that sample to another lab and see what they get. Massachusetts has on their books a secret shopper program. I believe to date they've used it 0 times, which is unfortunate. We have consumers bringing us in samples for testing. They'll buy a pre-roll, and it is not uncommon for us to see 100% inflation on the label over what's actually in the package. We also offer a free yeast and mold testing to consumers, producers, retailers, because there's a lot of product in the market that has mold that exceeds the state's regulatory limit. I would agree with many that Massachusetts requirements for yeast and mold testing or microbial testing may not be appropriate, but they are what they are. So until we change them.
Which way? Maybe they're too stringent or maybe too lax. What do you mean exactly there?
Well, so like many states, Massachusetts focuses on bacteria, yeast, and mold based on certain action limits. And so if you think about bacteria and mold, and yeast and mold, which are in our environment everywhere, we fail product even if it has beneficial bacteria in it, things that are not a detriment to human health. So I would say that we fail product unnecessarily because these may not be molds that are going to harm people. One of the things that I think, I don't know if many states have done this yet, but I think that when you start looking at microbial contamination and the levels that are appropriate, you almost have to consider route of administration. Mold spores being inhaled versus ingested. I'm not a microbiologist, but I would imagine, I'm not a toxicologist either, but I would imagine that different routes of administration would have different concerns. And so our yeast to mold or bacterial limits are not based on route of administration. And so I believe that we fail product unnecessarily. At the same time, I know that all labs are using different approaches for testing. I don't know how robust these are. I have some doubts in terms of the efficacy of those test methods. And as a result, I think we see a lot of moldy product that is on the shelves today. They may not be a health hazard to a healthy individual, but if somebody is purchasing medical marijuana because they have underlying conditions, maybe they shouldn't be smoking moldy marijuana, but I think they are.
I do want to ask this too, because, I've seen some of this among the public health officials here in Vermont. It just still feels like a lot of fear porn coming at me. A lot of that same kind of reefer madness that we've been seeing for the last however fucking long. And people that really just are presenting, like they're enacting drunk driving laws, basically just shifting that over to weed now, which I think is a bit of nonsense, personally, because they haven't been able to prove or show me any type of science that says this is dangerous. I don't know if that's anything you want to touch on, but I just started thinking of that based off your last comment.
I mean, impairment is a serious issue. People shouldn't be driving when they're impaired, whether that's alcohol or weed or whatever they are on. It could be some other kind of pharmaceutical, for pain. There haven't been very good correlations with blood levels of THC or THC metabolites that correlate well with impairment. So it's easy to take a blood sample or a urine sample and quantitate THC or THC metabolites. But if there's no correlation with impairment, then what value does that bring? And I think that's a little bit dangerous when you start. I think Washington State has a very low limit for THC in the blood, where even if you consumed yesterday, if you're a heavy user and you consumed yesterday but didn't consume today, but got in an accident and had your blood drawn, you're probably going to fail based on those limits, and you'll probably be charged with a DUI or whatever their version of that is. And then that goes as a statistic for THC accidents, or when maybe that's not really fair.
They count those weird and a number of studies that I've been looking at, including some that are quoted by our state here repeatedly. Let me sneak a question in here, if I could. Christine Stenquist, would you say it's extremely concerning that the state doesn't have any recalls, considering what you have seen professionally in the cannabis space?
Yes. Massachusetts has had a couple recalls, but I don't believe they were based on safety incidents, so they didn't necessarily find contaminated product in the market, although we do see contaminated market frequently. They just don't know that it's contaminated. In many respects, I think they choose not to know. They choose to not look at their own database. So recently, the data from our metric database for the seed to sale tracking, they've released some limited data on results from testing. And in that data, there's some clear indications that there's something going on, something hinky that is not right. Certainly with microbial testing, one lab has an average failure rate of 0.3% when the majority of the labs are right around 10% failure rate for product. How does one lab have a 0.3% failure rate for mold? I don't know how you do that unless either your testing method is not very effective or you're using it inappropriately. There's a number of reasons that could be behind that, but it should trigger the state to say, hey, something's not right. Let's take a closer look at it. And so even their own in-house data set shows that there's something amiss, whether it's potency inflation, potency cheating, yeast and mold shenanigans, whatever it is. There's data that is in the state's possession that they should look at and say, hey, something's wrong. Instead, it's been released under FOIA requests, and our lab, as well as MCR and other labs, are digging into this data and finding anomalies that are indicative of either fraud or incompetence, or just that something's not right. And unfortunately, our state is just really dragging their feet at digging into this deeper. They are trying to address it. They're trying to establish some consistency in how the laboratories report potency. Unfortunately, they issued a guidance document which was a little bit vague and suggestive. Rather than saying this is how the labs will do it, they said this is how the labs should do it. Well, yeah, we should, but is it a mandate? And they basically hemmed and hawed and never said, yes, it's a mandate.
Can I ask you something, Chris? If, say, hypothetically, a lab wanted to cheat on some of these tests, how would they do that?
Which tests? There's many ways to cheat. So
like potency. Let's start with potency, and then we'll do maybe pesticides and heavy metals and shit like that.
Well, on potency, cheating can come from the producer. So producer can. So in Massachusetts, the labs do not sample the product. So we get sent samples from a producer, and so that producer could take a sample that they're sending to the lab. They could dust it with some extra keef. They could treat it with X-ray so that it doesn't fail the microbial testing. There's a number of things that the producer can do. I'm not saying that they do, but I'm just saying there are, because of the way it's set up in our state, we don't have any visibility into the selection of samples sent to the testing. Once it gets to the lab, you can do some additional drying. So initially the Massachusetts reporting was to test the samples and report as is. You could dry them further. You can dust them with keef. You could take your THC distillate in a little bit of ethanol and make a little spray, and you could spray it on your flour just to boost that a little bit. On the analytical side, you can tweak your calibration curve slightly. Just a little bit of adjustment of the reference standards that we put in to build a calibration curve could be tweaked so it's such a minuscule level that it wouldn't be noticeable to an auditor, and yet you could easily impart, a 10-20% increase in potency results based on that calibration curve. So there's a number of ways to do it. You can just manipulate the data. I don't think it's as common anymore, but I think in the early days, labs were even dry labbing, which is where you never even just test a sample. You just make up numbers and report them.
Let's not and just say we did.
Yep. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot faster, high throughput.
And here's Josh Schweider again. Record sample mass wrong. It does seem like that's from the COAs I've seen. It's based on percentage by volume, or by weight. So all you have to do is if you're sampling half a gram, if that's what your protocol calls for. Josh is totally right. You weigh out like 550 milligrams, and you say, okay, well, all that cannabinoid is really in 500 milligrams. So again, when you are reviewing video surveillance, you can't catch these things. These things are invisible to an auditor's eye. And that's got to be very frustrating if you have a lab staff of 40 or 50 people, because you are relying on the integrity of your staff as well. And so you really have to have staff that you believe in and trust, and because you can't capture it all on video surveillance. Unless you had a lab where the analytical balances were Wi-Fi, you would record the weights by Wi-Fi, and we just haven't. It's expensive to do that level of tracking, and you shouldn't have to. I mean, so really, why is it in my best interest to plump somebody's potency? Well, today it is, because that's the way the industry has set itself up. The industry has set itself up to for consumers to look for the highest THC product. Therefore, producers were only testing with the labs that produce the highest THC results. We've had clients leave us say, look, I trust your values. I just can make more money by going to a lab that's, puts out higher potency values. And that's not how that transaction is supposed to go, Chris.
It's not how it's supposed to go.
That's ass backwards. And I've heard from some other lab guys that said, we've had executives from MSOs come in here and say, we want to use you guys, but only if you test everything over like 25%. And that's the opposite of how that transaction's supposed to go, in my estimation.
In the FOIA request data that was released from Metric, there was an example where one producer was testing with one lab for a long period of time, and you could see their potencies over time. I think their average was maybe around 22%. And then all of a sudden they went to another lab, a new lab, and those potencies jumped to like 36% overnight. There's just like a 30% increase in potencies just by changing lab. And again, this is data that the CCC or Cannabis Control Commissions should look at and say, this is not normal.
Have you guys presented them with this data?
Oh, we have. MCR has done a really good job at kind of digging into the data and presenting it. They've presented it at multiple public forums.
Presented it to me. I saw it.
You saw it. Okay. So Yasha Khan, they're a competitor, but they do great work. They have a similar agenda to us in that they're trying to see that the industry is, if the regulators aren't going to fix it, it's kind of up to us as laboratories to advocate for a better regulatory system. In Massachusetts, there have been some labs that have bound together to create a testing association. I think there's only 6 labs in it right now, trying to advocate and confront the Cannabis Control Commission to try and get them to communicate better, to communicate more effectively, and try and fix some of the problems that we see in the industry. But when you have regulators who don't really understand the problem. They're not chemists, they're not microbiologists, and they're trying to fix a problem that they don't understand. They come up with a solution which is not appropriate. And rather than sitting down with the labs and saying, what is your problems? What challenges do you face? How can we work together to create a regulatory program that is more effective, that would, number one, ensure consumer safety? That should be the number one goal for our Cannabis Control Commission. If you sit in on any of their public meetings, they frequently talk about diversity and inclusion and host community agreements. And a lot of these things are financially based. You very rarely hear them talk about consumer safety or worker safety.
Were you going to keep going? Because I was loving that, Chris.
Well, I mean, I think that those should be the top two priorities. And not to say that, I don't want to say that our regulators aren't concerned about safety, but it's usually seems like it's 4 or 5 on their list of priorities. They just seem to, I would think consumer safety should be the number one, and worker safety right there with that. And I just, when we express concerns, when I see product in the marketplace that I feel represents a significant concern to consumers, and I ask questions about it, I literally get no response oftentimes. They don't even have the courtesy to respond. I have asked for years, are synthetic cannabinoids produced in a regulatory program permissible? And I still haven't gotten an answer to that question. Can a producer synthesize Delta-9 THC for their gummies and chocolates?
Well, go ahead. This is on your hot topic list here.
It is.
And I'd love to come. Yeah, go ahead.
When I've asked the Cannabis Control Commission, they said, well, can you tell the difference between synthetic Delta-9 and synthetic Delta-8 and natural cannabinoids? And I say, yeah, all day long. It's the fingerprint of contaminants that we see. We see fingerprints of signals. We don't always understand every signal that we see in cannabis, but we see them all the time because we've analyzed tens, hundreds of thousands of samples, so we know what those patterns look like. And all of a sudden, when the synthetics hit the market, we see new patterns that didn't exist before in our database. And so as we see these, we now understand that these are synthetic byproducts. Again, this goes back to the contaminants that don't exist in nature. And so when I see these in a regulatory sample, I don't know how to report them. So can I include Delta-10 THC in my total THC? That was a question I asked our Cannabis Control Commission. To that, they said, okay, they didn't say anything. I have so many questions in them that just go unanswered. What kind of compounds are permissible in products? You know, can you add other active ingredients? Can you add caffeine to your products? Caffeine's in chocolate, it's in coffee, not a bad thing. I like caffeine myself, but if you're adding it as an ingredient, if your technician gets your decimal place off by one place, you could be killing somebody because now you had too much caffeine in it. Caffeine is a drug. And if it's in natural chocolate, I'm not worried about it. But if you're adding it as an active ingredient, my position is that it should be tested for to confirm that it was added at an appropriate level. We see many examples of that in the Massachusetts market. I have asked for a list of ingredients that have been approved for inclusion. They won't provide that. I asked what the process was to
Why not?
Don't know. They just don't answer. I've asked what the approval process is for a new ingredient. I get no answer. I ask who is responsible for approval of an ingredient. I get no answer. Can you put strawberry flavoring in a vape pen? Well, strawberry flavoring, when heated, on a vape coil, one of the thermal degradation byproducts is benzene, which is carcinogenic.
Oh.
So I have questions about what kind of products are permissible. And I just...
Strawberry flavoring. Epidiolex has strawberry flavoring in it.
But you don't smoke it.
Okay. So it's different in the combustion sense.
Yeah. So it's
okay.
Strawberry flavoring itself is not a problem. And so many flavorings, cinnamon flavoring, a lot of them have a chemical structure that when it's heated in a vape coil, goes through a thermal degradation, and some of the byproducts are concerning, whereas the actual cinnamon or strawberry flavoring may not be concerning. The thermal degradation products can be very concerning.
Mm. And it's really hard to get human trials done because of the negative health ramifications, it seems like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Chris, I want to get to your hot topic. I feel like we touched on a bunch of these, but I want to let you just let it rip here. And I want to do just one more of these here. Yeah. Chris Hudalla, ProVerde Laboratories. When I was on the phone, Chris, I asked him about his 4 hot topics. Well, the first one was fraudulent testing, which I feel like we touched on here. If there's anything else you'd like to add before I ask you about THCA stuff.
I think that the testing issue is a nationwide issue. It's not just Massachusetts. It's about standardized methods. There's a lot of organizations now, AOAC, ASTM. There's organizations that are working to create a standardized testing program for cannabis, and so that will help a lot. But at the other end, we still need a regulatory system that supports that incentivizes integrity. And right now, it incentivizes cheating, and it's set up. The people that cheat the most, do the best financially, and so it's been very struggling. Going through COVID and just some of the specific industry challenges. But I hope that it will get better.
Me too. And yeah, the second hot topic is the high THCA hemp.
Yeah, no such thing. High THCA hemp. So high THCA hemp is just marijuana. It's all cannabis. It should just be legalized. The fact that we are still, whether it's, in fact, when asked about a hemp product, the Cannabis Control Commission responded that they don't regulate hemp products. They only regulate cannabis. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Hemp is cannabis. Hemp doesn't know that it's not cannabis. High THCA hemp is being sold. People think it's a loophole in the Farm Bill. It's not a loophole. They just haven't read the Farm Bill. Farm Bill requires testing for total THC, which includes consideration of the acid component of the plant. So when you see something that is 0.2% delta 9 THC and 35% THCA, that's just marijuana. I would prefer that it be regulated all the same, regulated as hemp. But the fact that there's this dichotomy of how we regulate this plant, why can some people just produce marijuana and sell it across state lines with no testing and no regulatory oversight, and then the licensed producers are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in licensing fees and inspections and huge testing burdens and just incredible challenges to operate in a regulatory market and compete against these people who are just doing it without any regulatory oversight. And they're doing so, the funniest part is they're doing so under the Farm Bill, but the Farm Bill doesn't permit this. Very similar to the synthetics. So, some of the synthetics we see on the market are being produced under the Farm Bill. So Delta 8 can be created from CBD. HHC can be created from CBD. But when you start looking at some of the other hot products on the market, well, it's THCP or THCJD. These are being manufactured as hemp derivatives, but they are not derived from hemp. These are purely synthetic compounds. There's no starting ingredients in hemp that I'm aware of that would be appropriate for a conversion into THCP or THCJD, THCB, THCPO. It's a whole alphabet soup of synthetic drugs. And again, I think we're only in this current situation because of the prohibition on marijuana.
And you did say, I think on the phone, you said it felt a bit like the Emperor's New Clothes, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with the high THCA hemp. I've seen people that are literally selling marijuana in an open expo and law enforcement are walking by and the vendor is saying, see, it's hemp. It's got less than 0.3% delta 9 THC. So just because they're saying it's hemp, everybody's like, oh, okay, then you're okay. Go ahead, ship it across state lines. Go ahead and sell it to a minor because it's hemp. No, it's not hemp. Totally the emperor's new clothes.
Yeah, cool. And one of the last things I did want to ask about, and I know we touched on this a little, is these beverages being sold in Massachusetts. And I talked to Chris Ferrone said they were selling them like in liquor stores. And I'm super curious how that's played out, because we have CBD drinks here and stuff, but we haven't seen I haven't seen any of the synthetic cannabinoids popping up here.
So a lot of the beverages that we see in the market are hemp-derived delta 9 THC. And when you say hemp-derived delta 9, that can mean one of two things, and I don't know which it is without testing it. You can synthetically convert CBD into delta 9 THC and create your beverage, or through the extraction process, when you're creating CBD products, you also get a portion of the mother liquor which has THC in it, which can be recovered and used for production. Those products are actually really high quality. They usually have some CBD content in them as well. So they have delta 9 THC that was naturally derived with CBD, and they're creating products with that. And I applaud those products and the efforts that they're making to create those products. But then they're putting them in liquor stores and convenience stores. And so these are products that in almost every way are mirrored in the regulatory framework. And so if you're spending thousands of dollars on licensing and production and inspections and testing, you are now competing against somebody who has no requirement to test, no requirement to create a safe product, no requirement to be inspected, and you don't even know where these products are being manufactured oftentimes. And they're showing up in the unregulated market. This is when the CCC says, well, we don't regulate hemp, that we only regulate cannabis. So then they said, well, that would fall under the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture, MDAR. So when we talked to MDAR, they said, well, in order to produce or sell a hemp beverage, you have to have a MDAR license. And so these products are clearly inappropriate, but it doesn't matter because these are beverage products, and gummies and beverages, food products would be regulated under the Department of Public Health, Massachusetts Department of Public Health. So we called the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and said, what's with these beverages that are, sold in the unregulated market? They said, well, in Massachusetts, food and beverage products can only be made with constituents that are generally recognized as safe. It's also known as GRAS. It's a designation that I think the FDA gives it, that these products have been tested for safety. And so under Massachusetts law, you can only create products with those components. And since none of these components in hemp have received that designation, the Department of Public Health says these are clearly inappropriate for sale in Massachusetts. And I said, well, who enforces this? And they said, well, we leave it up to the local municipalities, as if every individual town Department of Health has the resources, financial and technological resources to enforce this. I think so far in Massachusetts, we've seen one city actually crack down on some of these products. But in general, in Massachusetts, it's a free-for-all. I was recently in Arizona working on some legislation there, and in their market as well. A lot of these synthetics and delta 9 beverages are commonplace. There rarely is an age gate, so it takes very little for a minor to buy these. You can buy them on Amazon. They're readily available everywhere.
That age gate is a joke. They're like, hey, are you 21? You just click yes, and then you're 21. That's
how many 12-year-olds are going to say no?
Fucking joke that is.
Yeah.
So I'm getting towards the end of my shit here, Chris. I do want to just slap another shameless slap here. Chris Hudalla, ProVerde Laboratories. Thanks so much for being here. I do want to just, I feel like we touch on most of your hot topics. These are going to be hot topics too. I think over the next 5 years, the lab stuff is going to be some of the hottest stories in the industry, if you ask me. It's very pertinent, and it's nice to connect with a lot of you guys. And if you would like to, before we get out of here, shameless plugs, shout outs, anything we missed right now, Chris?
I think the one thing that people should know is that there are people that have really good technology backgrounds that really care about this. You mentioned Josh, you mentioned Jeff. Christine has been working behind the scenes and now in front of the scenes. People that are trying to bring quality to this industry and, again, fight prohibition, because a lot of the problems and regulatory challenges are because it's still treated unequally between hemp and marijuana. I mean, it should just be treated as cannabis, and what regulation looks like, whether it looks like alcohol, I don't know, but it's got to change. And the regulatory feet dragging it's basically creating an unsafe situation for consumers, and they will pay the ultimate price.
And that's what this was all supposed to be about, right? It was like a safe and tested product for the consumers. So it bothers me when I hear stuff like that, Chris.
Yeah, it was supposed to be about patients and changing the way we medicate and recreate, and now it just is kind of about a money grab.
I'm going to pull you back up here. Chris Hudalla, do you got anything else for us? You got any shout outs you want to do? Because I'm going to sign it off if you're all done.
Nope, I'm good.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm still waiting on my voiceover guy to get me this, but
the devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print.
Peace, guys.